In 1995, something disappeared from Yellowstone National Park that nobody noticed at first. Not a species going extinct, but something far more subtle. The rivers started dying. The streams narrowed. The wetlands dried up. Songbirds vanished. Frogs disappeared. The water grew warm and sluggish, and the fish began to thin out. Rangers were baffled. They had been protecting this land for over a century. How could an ecosystem this protected, this carefully managed, simply start falling apart? The answer was a single animal, an animal that had been missing for nearly 70 years. And when they finally brought it back, it didn't just fix the rivers, it changed the physical geography of the entire park. It changed the direction of the rivers themselves. And the animal that did all of this wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a bear. It was something most people would walk right past without a second glance. But before we reveal what it is, you need to understand what was really happening in Yellowstone. Because the story isn't what you think. Most people have heard about the wolves of Yellowstone. 14 wolves were reintroduced in 1995, and the story goes that they chased the elk out of the valleys, which let the willows grow back, which brought back the beavers. It's a neat story, a tidy little chain reaction, and it's only partially true, because the beavers were already gone long before the wolves left. In fact, beavers had been trapped out of Yellowstone almost completely by the 1930s, 70 years before the wolves came back. The real architect of the ecosystem had already vanished, and nobody realized what that meant. Here's what a beaver actually does. It doesn't just build a dam, it builds an entire water system. When a beaver cuts down a tree and blocks a stream, it doesn't just create a pond. It creates a slow-moving, multi-layered wetland that spreads water across the valley floor. That water seeps into the ground and stays there for months, even during drought. The soil becomes saturated, the water table rises, and suddenly, in a landscape that was drying out, life has a place to take hold again. In Yellowstone, without beavers, the streams cut deeper and deeper into the earth. They became narrow channels like gutters, rushing water straight through the valley without letting any of it spread out. The wetlands disappeared. The willows that depended on seasonal flooding dried up and died. And without willows, the songbirds left. Without still water, the frogs and amphibians vanished. Without cold, shaded pools, the cutthroat trout populations crashed. One missing animal, and the entire valley started unraveling like a thread pulled from a sweater. But here's where it gets interesting. When the wolves came back in 1995, they did help. They pushed elk away from the valleys, and the willows started to recover. But the streams were still dead. The water was still rushing through those deep, narrow channels. The wetlands were still gone. The wolves had set the stage, but the real restoration didn't begin until something else happened. The beavers came back on their own. Drawn by the recovering willows, a few beavers wandered back into Yellowstone's northern range. And what they did next is something no human engineer has ever been able to replicate. They built dams. Not one, not two, but dozens of them, layered across the stream network like steps on a staircase. Each dam slowed the water just enough to let it spread sideways. And when the water spread, it pooled. And when it pooled, it soaked into the ground. And when the ground soaked it up, the entire valley floor began to change. Within just a few years, the narrow gutters that used to be streams became wide, braided channels. The water table rose by several feet. Old wetlands that had been bone dry for decades suddenly had standing water again. And life responded immediately. Willows exploded across the valley floor, some growing over 6 feet in a single season. Willow flycatchers, a bird species that had essentially disappeared from the park, came back. Frogs and salamanders returned in numbers that stunned researchers. The ponds created by beaver dams became nurseries for young cutthroat trout, and the trout population began to recover for the first time in half a century. But it didn't stop there. The beaver ponds trapped sediment. Over time, that sediment built up, and the stream beds actually rose. The streams became shallower, wider, and slower. They started to meander, to curve back and forth across the valley instead of cutting straight lines through the dirt. The physical shape of the land was changing. And here's the part that sounds impossible, but it's been documented by researchers. The rivers literally changed direction, not in some dramatic overnight way, but gradually, over years, as the beaver dams redirected the flow, as the sediment filled in the old channels, and as the water found new paths across the valley floor. A single species of rodrit had reshaped the geography of one of the largest national parks in the United States. And this isn't just happening in Yellowstone. In London, a city of 9 million people, beavers were reintroduced in 2023. A neighbourhood near Heathrow Airport had been flooding every time it rained heavily. The local tube station would fill with water. Engineers had drawn up plans for a massive drainage project costing millions. Instead, community groups suggested trying beavers. 5 beavers were released into a small urban wetland. Within months, they built dams that held back the floodwater. The tube stations stopped flooding. The biodiversity at the site exploded. Fish returned. Birds returned. New kits were born. And all of this happened less than 10 kilometres from one of the busiest airports in the world. In Scotland, beavers were officially reintroduced in 2009 after being extinct in Britain for over 400 years. They were hunted out for their fur, their meat, and a glandular oil used in perfumes. Now there are over 1,000 of them spread across the country's river systems, and everywhere they go, the same pattern repeats. Wetlands reappear. Water quality improves because the dams trap sediment and pollutants. Amphibian populations surge, and the land becomes more resilient to both floods and droughts, because the beaver-created wetlands act like a giant sponge, absorbing water during storms and releasing it slowly during dry periods. The reason this matters isn't just about beavers. It's about a concept that ecologists call a keystone species. A keystone is the stone at the top of an arch. Remove it and the entire structure collapses. Beavers are a keystone species. So are wolves. So are sea otters. So are elephants. When you remove a keystone species, the ecosystem doesn't just shrink. It transforms into something completely different, something usually much poorer, much less diverse, and much less stable. And when you bring them back, the reverse happens. The ecosystem rebuilds itself, not all at once, but in waves, each change triggering the next, like dominoes falling in reverse. That's what happened in Yellowstone. The wolves came back, and the elk changed their behaviour. The willows grew back, and the beavers returned. The beavers built dams, and the water spread. The water spread, and the wetlands reformed. The wetlands reformed, and the frogs and birds and fish came back. And the rivers themselves shifted, responding to a force that had been absent for 70 years. One animal, one missing piece, and an entire ecosystem rebuilt itself from the ground up. Not because humans engineered it, not because someone poured concrete or dug channels or planted trees by the thousands, but because a rodent with iron in its teeth and an instinct older than humanity itself did what it has always done. It built, it dammed, it flooded, and life followed. If you found this story inspiring, there are dozens more just like it. Every week, somewhere on Earth, a species comes home. A forest wakes up. A dead river flows again. Subscribe to Nature's Return, and I'll bring you the next one.